by way of introducing this evening's talk, and perhaps the next two as well, I think it's important for us to try to keep in mind that, let's say, the spiritual endeavor, the reaching out to greater and more meaningful and more insight-producing realities is manifold. It's even as it is not confined to conventional religiosity, so it is not confined to unconventional religiosity, or for that matter to magic, sorcery, witchcraft, spiritualism, things like that. They may all be part of it, but in many ways, without using this in a pejorative sense, these endeavors that I just mentioned are sort of like the top of the wave in a body of water. If I want to be a little nastier about it, they are the froth. And in addition to that, there are other very important factors which at times really move in various ways, to various extent, and in various directions, the soul of the culture. And that is why I picked the three talks tonight and the next 2 weeks, dealing with major literary figures, primarily of the 20th century, no longer reaching into the 21st, and I picked such figures whom I felt, whether we are aware of that or not, had really a very great impact on the culture. And nowadays, when everything is questioned, one thing I think can never be justly questioned, and that is the importance of the culture within which we live. It might be this way, it might be that way, but it's very, very important. And there are certain figures, in the past they were primarily literary figures, who impacted that culture in a major way, and often in a way that should be of interest to us. And that's why I picked a certain number of literary figures for this series. And the first one whom I picked, obviously, one tends to pick first someone whom one likes. And let's say Lawrence Durrell, from the first time that I came across any of his writings, was always very high in my estimation. I am even proud and ashamed to say at the same time. I'm proud to say that at a certain point, when Mr. Durrell was still alive in France, I managed in a strange and roundabout way, by seeking out some people here who I knew were friends of his, to send him my first major book, the Gnostic Jung. And he wrote a very lovely letter back to me, which then I promptly lost. Then a few years ago I found it again, and now I lost it again. But it was a lovely letter in which he commended me of having written about Jung, whom he liked very greatly, and that as I apparently knew, he also had a long interest in matters Gnostic, and so it's a lovely little letter. So that's just a little personal keynote there. Now then, although Lawrence Durrell was writing poetry and novels steadily since his early 20s, his first book, to be signed with his own name, and whereby I mean not signed outside as an author, but inside, to appear under his own name, was a book called the Black Book. Interestingly enough, now it is attributed to the sort of the last installment of the esoteric and secret writings of Jung, whom he liked. But this Black Book was started by him in 1936. I was around 5 years old at the time, so I did not read it. Lawrence Durrell did not come to the attention of the general readership in England and in America. However, until about 30 years later, until the 1960s, when his sequel of 4 books consisting of the following, these are, well, 3 of these are proper names. The other one is the name of a place, Justine, the first one, Balthasar, the second one, Mount Olive, which is the place, and Clare, which is the fourth one, which came to be known collectively as the Alexandria Quartet. And until these 4 came out, they really brought him to the attention of a quite large reading public, at least at the time. The author was a product of the last period of the greatness of the British Empire for the following reason. He was born in the Himalaya region of India, and spent his first 10 years in India. His family returned for a few years to England, but in 1933 they went to live, what in England is called on the continent, which doesn't mean that they are necessarily on the continent, but somewhere near the continent of Europe. Yeah. So he was born, as I mentioned that, in 1933. The Durrell family settled on the Mediterranean island of Corfu, which is certainly off the continent, but a very nice place. And there they remained until the war forced them to leave in 1939. World War II saw Lawrence Durrell in the capacities of intelligence officer and diplomat in various countries, primarily in the Mediterranean region, such as Yugoslavia, Greece, Rhodes, and last not least, Egypt, where he became fascinated by the ancient city of Alexandria and its mysterious atmosphere of timeless, transformative wisdom, and which created the background, of course, for his now renowned 4 books, the Alexandria Quartet. Now, Egypt attracted, in those days, not so much now, but in those days it attracted interesting people. And I could sort of remonstrate with myself that in that short correspondence that I had with Lawrence Durrell, I did not mention to him an uncle once removed of mine, who probably during much of the time that Lawrence Durrell was in Egypt, but mostly in Cairo, not in Alexandria, lived there. He was a cousin of my mother's, who in a rather romanticized and sometimes inaccurate way was the principal figure in the movie The English Patient. The English Patient was really a Hungarian, and he was a cousin of my mother. He had the same name as my grandmother. In any event, I didn't do that, and since I didn't do it, that particular connection, if it ever existed, never came to my attention, to my great regret. But you know, there were interesting people in Egypt, and I say primarily in Cairo. But of course, we need to remember that that Alexandria was the ancient cultural center, through which the Greco-Egyptian, Roman culture and spirituality received an actual rebirth that lasted more or less 500 years, from sort of 1st and 2nd century BC until about the 3rd or 4th century AD. Now, in that connection, the gods, as we might say in the language of the ancients, use many developments and conditions of statecraft, of culture, of personal predilections and so forth, statecraft, war, politics, for the advancement of the spirit. This also needs to be kept in mind. I mean, none of us like war, especially when we find ourselves in the midst of it, of which, to my great regret, I know more than I ever desired to know. But at the same time, look at all the developments over history, or at least some of them, and see how the movement of peoples, the wars, the various developments of that sort, events of that sort, which generally we don't consider to be very felicitous, brought with them incredible cultural and spiritual influences, which sometimes lasted for a very, very great period of time. So that is why we have to be, which is difficult for someone of a Hungarian temperament like myself, it's very difficult for us to say if we see in our own lives or in other people's life anomalous and maybe difficult situation, wars, upheavals, pestilences, things like that, and to see anything good in it. It's only when, as time passes, and then some of the seeds that have been sown begin to germinate, but we say, well, you know what, this probably wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for that disaster. And that also needs to be kept in mind, and it's really a very Gnostic idea, because the Gnostic, Hermetic, and to some extent Neoplatonic matrix of thought has always recognized that the old American ballroom saying, it takes two to tango. So that the dualities are always there. No doubt the unpleasant dualities strike us first, but it's always there, and so we have to be aware of it. And that's not to say that we should use the good as an excuse for the evil, but to recognize that they are there. And so the fashion, in this case, what I'm just saying, I brought this up because of Lawrence Durrell's background, his birth, his upbringing, and so forth, which was it was in the Raj in British India. And since then, of course, there has been, and I guess there is still going on, a sort of fashionable put-down on colonialism, and I always considered that of dubious validity, because once again, all right, depending on who you were dealing with, of course, the colonialism of the colonial rule, shall we say, of the British in India was of an entirely different caliber and on a much, much higher and more benign level than, let's say, the rule of the Belgians in the Belgian Congo. I don't know why. I lived in Belgium for almost a year, and I really liked the Belgians. In fact, I have been cajoled by some of my Belgian friends. They said, look, stay here, they will give you a permanent visa, and then you come to the Congo, and you'll become rich. And I said, no, sir, no, ma'am, me no go to Congo. And I didn't. But let's say, it was very, very different, really, from one place to where you go. And moreover, and I'm not going to spend more time on that now, because it's really sort of, in this case, not beating a dead horse, but feeding a dead horse, because because the colonial arrangements have pretty well gone by the wayside. But let me just indicate one thing here, which is only one of the many virtuous things, shall we say, that arose from that, which means mobility and communication, which is, I think, according to all intelligent psychology, is probably the greatest stimulant of consciousness in the history of the world. Without mobility and communication, the mind doesn't grow. The psyche has no real food. And if you, I don't know if you were born in Chad, or if you were born in the corner of northern Scotland, if you never went anywhere, I would say you didn't have a heck of a lot of stimulation for your consciousness. But on the other hand, if you did, then possibly you really came away much more stimulated and with a greater consciousness, which is obviously what happened to people like Lawrence Durrell, who, owing to their long residence in India and then in various other countries, had really, let's say, accumulated that consciousness that came to be expressed in literary form. So that is important to keep in mind. Would have been a Lawrence Durrell, would have been a T.S. Eliot, or for that matter, let's say on a little bit on the other side, would there have been the great 19th century scholars, including the Orientalists, let's say the scholars who first wrote about India, about the Vedas, about the Upanishads, things like that in a scholarly way, people like Monier Williams, and let's see, there was one with a German name who also lived in India at that time. His name doesn't come to my mind. But also, let's see, poets like Sir Edwin Arnold, who was primarily really a poet laureate of India, and who wrote this wonderful Victorian poetic works, one about the life of Buddha, one about the Bhagavad Gita, one about some others. And these are the ones that really brought the culture of India to the attention of countless literate people. Now, what is Durrell's central interest? Is there such a thing? And I think there is. And it's if you don't even have to read much between the lines, even if you just read what's in the lines themselves and not between them. I think you'll soon find out, and I think that my formulation of this is not too far off, that his central interest is he's no longer among us, of course, was the transformation of the poet in the crucible of life. So, what happens to the insightful, alert, romantic, inquisitive, poetic soul in the midst of life? The poet-writer, he often used that term because he was that. The poet-writer creates, but in order to create with authenticity, the creation must come from where? From within himself. To create, one has to, as Durrell said, actually in those words, one has to create oneself. Otherwise, one's creations are of no true value. So, as you transform, as you create yourself, then your creations will of course testify to that. In his black book, which I said it was his first book in print, under his own name, he wrote, and I quote, "Books should be built of one's own tissue, or not at all. The struggle is not to record the experience, but to record oneself. The book then does not properly exist. There is only my tissue, my guilt, transmuted by God knows what alchemy into a few pints of green ink." Oh, he used green ink. My mother used green ink. I think that's probably all she had in common with Lawrence Durrell, but into a few pints of green ink and handsome paper. And they said, "Understand me well." So using these principles, we see Durrell work on the transformation of the poet, beginning with the Black Book probably, and continuing certainly through the Alexandria Quartet, and then later on, some years later, the Avignon Quincunx. So the Black Book, although written on the Greek island of Corfu, where his family lived, the family incidentally seemed to consist mostly of his mother and his siblings. I think his father must have passed away already by that time, because you never hear about him. And I don't think he left the family except perhaps for the other world. In any event, the Black Book, although it was written in Corfu, is set in England. The protagonist is a young poet, obviously Durrell himself, who is quaintly called Lawrence Lucifer. Now that's a nice name. But you got to remember the double meaning also, because Lucifer means the bringer of the light. In any event, it was a name very much beloved by H.P. Blavatsky, for instance, who edited for years a very fine journal. We must have some copies of it, not going back that far, of Lucifer, which had a beautiful picture on the front. But anyway, so Lawrence Lucifer, he is desperately trying to extricate himself from the limitations of his background, from the prosaic features of English life, and thereby attain to true poetic freedom. Now, what does this mean? They're just highfalutin words. What does it mean especially to us, who are not in a certainly in a technical sense probably could, although I don't know all of you, maybe there is a great poet here, in any event, those of us who don't call ourselves poets very much, what does that mean to us? So here is the answer from his Black Book. Let us define man, that is of course in the language the human, as a poet, perpetually conspiring against himself. Well, now this is a little bit difficult to interpret, but this seems to mean, first of all, that all people are poets. They are capable of transforming a life of prose into a life of poetry. They are capable. Life can be lyrical if we take up, like the ancient Greeks would say, when we take up the lyra, the instrument, the lyra, the poetic instrument, that is of course the instrument that the Greek poets play, and then they exclaim and sing their poetry to it in olden times. The poetic view of life is not just for a select few, but that all people are capable of it. At least this is Durrell's position. Life without magic, without poetic imagination, he feels, and I think it's easy to feel along with him, such a life is no life at all. Imagination, still clear in the Middle Ages, the very word imaginatio in Latin implied magic. It contains the word mag, M-A-G, which in turn is related to the word for greatness, in Latin magnus, in Greek mega. That is how life is magnified. And that's not a bad term. Because isn't it true that so many of our preoccupations, concerns, our obsessions in this earthly life are suffering from littleness, if I may. They are too little. They are insignificant in a real sense. You might say, well, what's insignificant about 2 years of pestilence or people dying? Well, it depends. Depends how much meaning you derive from what is going on in the world. And I have a sneaking, not so sneaking suspicion that most people don't get anything out of it at all. Or what they get out of it is bad stuff, if you don't mind me saying so. Why is that so? Because people are unimaginative, lacking in magical proclivities, and, well, I don't know whether I should say that, but I will. They're stupid. They are what in German we call a Dummkopf, a stupid head. There is not enough active intelligence there to derive meaning out of the experience. And I can confess that too, because in so-called normal conditions, I would say I tried to lead a pretty conscious life for a long time. But the last couple of years, it was awfully difficult, and still is. Because there are, when it comes right down to it, they may be very painful to nations and to people, but they are distractions. A distraction is something that that pulls you away from something. What does it pull us away from? It pulls us away from what we really should be thinking about, what we really should be talking about, what we really should be writing about, namely meaningful and magical and poetic things. But we can't. And it's probably more difficult these days because of the constant impinging upon us of balderdash from what should be means of communication but they are means really that only communicate their own balderdash for the most part. And that's very, very regrettable and very difficult. So in any event, you got to keep in mind, in the view, let's say, of Lawrence Durrell, and really of all the sort of poetic, insightful, imaginative, magical souls throughout history, Paracelsus, Agrippa in the Middle Ages, all kinds of people who exercised the imaginatio, they were thereby inflamed with enthusiasm. As Shakespeare puts it, the poet's eye in a fine frenzy rolling, indicating that the poet has to have a poetic altered state of consciousness to be really a good poet. All things may be viewed in two ways, prosaic and poetic. At least that would be our Lawrence Durrell's approach, and I agree with him. This sort of thing is important, and it's not all that different, although stated in another set of words, to Jung's position, who said everything, and especially everything important in life, originates in the psyche. He doesn't know, now it's myself commenting on Jung, which is always a little bit difficult and maybe misleading. But let's say, it's not on the mountaintop, it's not on the skyscraper, it's not in the White House in Washington, it's especially not on the damn television screen and the computer screen, but it is in the psyche. If it's not in the psyche, it's nowhere. If it is in the psyche, then it is somewhere, and not only that, but the possibility exists that it is going somewhere. You see, Jung said that we have the words, for instance, when writing about my friends and some of our friends, the Gnostics, that he respected and revered the Gnostics because they were about the only people, he said, within certain historical periods, who recognized the immense value of the psyche and what is there. And that's a pretty big compliment, So these are, let's say, important issues. The second most important element that emerges from the Black Book is that although we are all poets, we as poets are also still, as he put it, personally conspiring against ourselves. Now that's difficult to admit, Yes, I belong to a conspiracy theory against myself. Now how do we do this, according to Lawrence Durrell? The poetic life is not gained or perpetuated, he says, without a battle. Society, families, the economies of our lives, our own dullness and laziness and many more factors are ever at work to diminish us. He puts this somewhat and what should I call it, somewhat eunuch-oriented term. They are at work to emasculate, to castrate us poetically. Taking the worthwhileness, taking the moxie out of our lives. So the majority of persons are poets who have been diminished, who have allowed their poet nature their creative nature to be taken away from them. And I think that when we think about that, it's much easier to recognize this process in someone else than in yourself. Then we might agree. So let us look at a few of those in part, at least in Durrell's own perspective. Number one, the first great area of such diminishment, or as he put it, poetic castration, is what he called environment. Now the term environment used for, I don't know, forests and trees, nowadays that was not used, the word was not used in that sense in his time. So just like the prophet is without honor in his own country, the poet is often without poetic freedom in his own country. So in a psychological sense, we all need to get away from home, from the, what's it, the apron strings of our background. In psychology, we would call it the home is the mother unconscious, the great mama. We have to learn to get our distance from the tyranny of our background. And that's true of everybody. Family, culture, tradition, our roots are important. See, this is always the great dichotomy. They are important, but they are also our limitations. So we must take our leave, at least from time to time, from them in order to acquire consciousness. The medieval pattern, which is very little remembered nowadays, of traveling scholars, traveling clerics, troubadours, even traveling tradesmen, is an interesting example. Because what people did, say, 13th, 14th, 15th century, right around there, those who had a bit of a flame of intellect burning in their souls and so forth, who wanted to learn, who wanted to had that individuational drive, they packed up and marched away from home. And then they had a vague idea, there's an interesting university in Paris, it's called the Sorbonne. That's where I'm going to go. But man, that's so damn far away. I says, don't worry, I'll get there. He took his stick and kept walking. And on the way were primarily the monasteries. They stopped at the monastery door. I'm a traveling scholar, Father. Could you give me overnight quarters and some food? Oh, yes, my son, come on in. We even used to learn a medieval song like that in Latin, you know. I don't think I should break into song. Sumus devagantium, ordine laudando, petimus viaticum, poro properando. That's the main thing. We are of the traveling ones, you know, and we are asking for a way bread for our road. And then the second verse was. Aber sie now it switches into German. Aber sie illustrissimus war in jungen Jahren auch als Wagensklericus durch das Land gefahren, which means the illustrious Father Abbot, whose monastery they came from, in his young years had also traveled through the land as a traveling cleric. So he will understand us, because all the intelligent people came out of that process, and but it wasn't only those who were going to study Latin or become clergy or whatever, but all kinds of other people who were learning a trade. Oh, there are some really good thinkers or real good carpenters in, in Rhineland-Westphalia. So we'll go from Austria or from Hungary, we'll march all the way over there, we'll find a master who will teach us, and then we will become master craftsmen. So this moving back and forth, that mobility was a real consciousness stimulator. And then, of course, usually, then when they were done, then they marched home and established their own, whatever it was, different professions at home. So, but they had to do it away from home. Then you can bring it back home and enrich the home. So these are important issues, and they are symbolic issues. Now then, that being the case, in a different way, by different modalities, and then at a later period, this also existed to a very great extent in the United States of America. What do you think the movement to the west, the covered wagons, the cowboys on horseback, and all moving, what do you think that was all about? Seeing something new, experiencing something different, learning something different, having new experiences, and thereby expand your consciousness. You might even say that even the song from the musical Cabaret, on the basis of Christopher Isherwood's lovely book, which originally was called the Berlin Diaries. What good is it sitting alone in your room? Go hear the music play. Life is a cabaret, old chum, come to the cabaret. So again, get out, get away from home, have experiences, have fun. But with the fun, if you do it right, there also comes consciousness, insight. A little bit of alchemy, a little bit of transformation. And if you don't engage in those things, then that is not likely to happen. No doubt there are always factors that slow this process down. But people who are adventurous and who have that drive toward the poetic, they can shed their prosaic shackles. So said Lawrence Durrell. Now, Durrell came to give expression to the impulse in moving to a scene of poetic transformation from the London of the Black Book, I mean the scene, of the Black Book in London, to Alexandria in Egypt. From the limiting local culture, moving to the exotic, the ancient metropolis, the city of Alexander, which now was declining, but it has certainly been once the greatest cultural center of the ancient world. Durrell was inspired in this quest by several influences. One, Marcel Proust, the great French writer, whose immense creative ability he admired and envied. Henry Miller, our own American, whose Tropic of Cancer he had read just before writing his own Black Book. So these old boys and girls all knew each other. Henry Miller with Tropic of Cancer, and he felt that Miller was admirable because he engaged in a surrealistic extension and thereby a psychological defanging of what people got terribly excited about. What do people get terribly excited about? Well, sometimes when they are young, sex. And that Henry Miller had a way of dealing with it so that, as Durrell said, he defanged it. Well, I suppose, I'm not going to let my imagination play with that one. In any event, these were some of the influences that Durrell took with him to, and that at the same time also drew him to Alexandria specifically. But of course he arranged with the British authorities during the war to send him there. He didn't go on his own, but he managed to arrange it. And this was also a kind of a nice thing, if you think of it, when the British Empire was all over the world. There were these fellows, and women for that matter, who came out of the academic world or the social world of England, and then managed to show up in India, managed to show up in Egypt, managed to show up in Arabia, Lawrence of Arabia, managed to show up in Persia, like the people who translated the Rubaiyat and things like that, because they were adventurous and intellectually very active people, and the system allowed for them to go to these places, often at government expense, which makes really traveling and going to foreign lands usually a lot easier. So that also needs to be kept in mind. There was a kind of a cultural translation. It's different than sitting at home and not going anywhere but looking at your computer screen. I think it is different, and in a good way. So the lure of Alexandria, and he did not hesitate to call it the Gnostic Alexandria, drew Durrell onto itself, as it had others in the past and the present, including one of my great archetypal figures, whose picture I think is somewhere over there, Vladimir Solovyov, the wild young Russian scholar who went on a scholarship this before, of course. He died in the year when World War I started, I think. Anyway, he was gone by the time of the terrible things in Russia. But Solovyov went on early 20th century, he went on with a scholarship to England. While he was in England, he had a vision. And the Gnostic Sophia, the great celestial lady, appeared to him and said, "You come to Egypt." Solovyov said, "Yes, ma'am," or its equivalent in Russian, and he packed up and left for Egypt. To look for Sophia. Meanwhile, he had very little money. In England, he could still, I don't know why I'm now branching out, but it's a similar thing. You know, he had the vision and he went. And he went with his heavy Russian overcoat and all of that to Egypt. Okay, he went out in the middle of the night under the pyramids in a long Russian overcoat in Cairo, outside of Cairo. So there were brigands there, then as now. But they looked at him in that long overcoat and they thought he was a ghost. They ran away, and Solovyov was there standing by the pyramid. And then he began to smell the smell of the roses, the roses of Sophia. And there she was, there she stood in front of him and talked to him and instructed him about various things. But he also he had to go to Egypt to have the vision. Now, all right, what is there about Egypt and about Alexandria? Well, Jacques Lacarrière, who was a good friend of Lawrence Durrell, especially toward the end of Durrell's life, and who wrote he's a French poet. He wrote a lovely little book about the Gnostics, which came out quite early in the 60s. And this is what he wrote about Alexandria. So this was kind of the vision of Alexandria that Lawrence Durrell and Lacarrière and some of these people shared. Crucible, burning glass, mortar and blast furnace, the still wherein all heavens, all gods, all visions are mixed, distilled, infused and transfused. Such was Alexandria in the 2nd century. Look, let's see, look wherever you will. Interrogate history from any standpoint or level whatever, and you will find all races represented there, except perhaps the Chinese who had not yet arrived and who I ought to hope probably there now, because they're everywhere. Now why did I bring that up? Anyway, all continents, Africa, Asia, Europe, and all ages, ancient Egypt, whose sanctuaries are preserved there, the ages of Athens and Rome, of Judea, Palestine, and Babylon, all these elements are gathered together in the north of the delta, this city which is to the river what lungs are to men, and branches to a tree, the place through which they breathe and the source of their inspiration. So this was the kind of vision that Lawrence Durrell had of Alexandria, and then of course Lacarrière also wrote it down. So this Alexandria became the setting of Durrell's greatest work, the crucible of the prophet's transformation, as he also called it. Thus, the poet's first great danger, as I mentioned, is environment, and the answer to Durrell is a change, even an alienation from one's original environment. Now, secondly, the second great area of poetic problem is that, so Durrell felt, that of conventional society, of middle class, of true blue family life. Now you've got to remember this is in the early middle part of the 20th century, not today. True blue for family life, which in its routines, economic responsibilities, securities, which are the great danger to the poetic soul. And you know what is the great danger to the poetic soul today? The damnable politics, that's what it is. The fanaticism and the ideologies which are siphoned out of old Europe and which have caused millions and millions of people perish over there already, and which are filtering over here. That's what we are suffering from now. Well, I tell you what, it wouldn't hurt to get a little bit back to middle class life in preference to that. Anyway, now I had my effusion here, so maybe I can go on. In any event, so these are the issues. So the Alexandria Quartet, as well as some subsequent less-known works as Tunc and Monsieur, well, Monsieur is definitely part of the Avignon Quincunx, which are 5 books that he wrote later on. These make the poet protagonist move in very unconventional and bohemian surroundings. And when it comes right then to it, if especially when you are thus inclined and fairly young, that is fun to read. What the heck? Unconventional and bohemian surroundings. The first big book in the Alexandria Quartet, Justine, is the name, of course, of a lady, the great mysterious heroine of the first part of the quartet, because she's there not only in the book Justine, but subsequently as well. The great mysterious heroine. Well, from some points of view, she might not be considered to be such a terribly admirable girl, but she's interesting to read about. She is an adulteress, and she associates with a lot of prostitutes, which at that time was certainly also questionable with homosexual people, and all sorts of unconventional situations in abundance as described in the quartet. But unlike maybe some other writers, Durrell has his reasons for bringing up these features of his heroine. He's trying to show us an environment where mobility, movement, flux, the kaleidoscopic changes of life and relationships keep the flame of consciousness and the light of poetic freedom alive. In other words, the things that Justine gets involved in, for instance, they are like the fire under the alchemist's retort. Keep her and her associates bubbling, and keep them from going asleep in consciousness. So there's no time to stop, no opportunity to stagnate, and no minute to lose. You got to keep going. Don't be complacent, don't be comfortable, lest the muse fly away. This is the poetic spirit of Durrell. So, and this is very much the milieu of the Alexandria Quartet. Now, Durrell's own attitude is well portrayed by the by what? Well portrayed by this quotation from the Black Book. We are nothing if we cannot convert the dross of temporal death. If we cannot present our check at the bank and receive for our daily death a fee in good, clean sovereigns, images, heat, water, the statues in the park, snow in the hills, a terrific action of the senses, the dead bullion of dying cashed in clean coin day by day, and every morsel of broken tissue redeemed for us. By the love perhaps this winter comet, a poem. What a guy. So if you would have your poet's soul live, your own poetic soul live, says Durrell to us, you must die day by day. Well, others have said that. I think there was a man who is not exactly known as a poet, but quite an important writer, namely St. Paul, the apostle of Paul of Tarsus, who said that I die daily. You must sacrifice the security and the so-called permanence of the everyday world, but you must present the bill to life for this, as he puts it. You must gain increased intensity of perception, of imagination, of the depth of experience. We must give up much, but we have much to gain. These are, I think, actually Durrell's words. Now, the third great enemy of poetic creativity, Durrell informs us, through all his works really, is a certain kind of non-involvement in life. Now I know that this could be very much anathema to some people, but you have to try to understand what he means. Not mind your life as ordinary people live it. The dull, trivial life of the slaves of this world, but rather an other kind of life. That is the one that we should be involved in instead of the previous one, namely excitement, romance, anxiety, stress, intrigue, mystery, and the danger that is so well portrayed in the Alexandria Quartet. The poet Darley in the book, who is the protagonist of the quartet, who is obviously Durrell himself, is by no means the ivory tower wallflower artist who begrudges life its vital energies, but he has and then has none left for his own art. This may puzzle some because of some popular notions about artistic creativity. But if you look down in history, even just a little bit, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo Buonarroti, Richard Wagner, many great artists were intensely involved in life. They didn't just sit at their desk. But Durrell seemingly has yet another reason, and it is a good one. It may be formulated like this: the artist, the poet, is not, but becomes. The artist, like the alchemical philosopher's stone, is the product of an ongoing transformation. And the arena of this transformation is life. And the more intense, the more intriguing a life, the better. At least that is his position. But he also tells us life of love and intrigue and excitement and mystery represents only 3 dimensions of the specialty of the artist's development. There, in fact, these are in fact aptly symbolized by other figures in the Alexandria Quartet: Justine, Balthasar, and Mount Olive, because Mount Olive is also a person. Mount Olive. In the trilogy of these 3 people, which is part of the quartet, Durrell deals with the alchemical transformation of the artist, almost like the black, white, and red stage of alchemy. The weirdness and the excitement of life in Alexandria. Politics, love, sex, commerce, plots, intrigues, occultism, all intermingled, a seething mass of active mystery. And behind it all, the old archetypes of Ptolemaic Alexandria, particularly the Gnostics, whom he mentions over and over again. Quotations from Valentinus appear again and again amidst intrigue and strange convolutions of life, primarily in Justine. The last volume, Claire, you are welcome to look at some of them here, I didn't bring all of them with me, introduces the fourth dimension, as it were. And this is, here the artist is redeemed by art. Life changes into art. Durrell, the main character, having survived the great debacle of his life with the mysterious woman Justine, and let me tell you, she's a real number, and all the astonishing intrigues connected with it, is now ready to become a true artist, Durrell. He has met the challenge of life. He didn't withdraw. He was transformed by the alchemy of love and Alexandria, and now he is himself. He had participated in all things life had offered, but he didn't compromise his soul. He not only remained himself, but became more of himself in the process. The time is going with us. There is a passage in the book Clear, which I have down there, which perhaps I'll read to you next time. So beginning with the Black Book and continuing with the well-known monumental Alexandria Quartet, Durrell has shown us the transformation of the poet. The Avignon Quincunx is a little bit more diffuse and doesn't quite have that sort of that alchemical focus. Although there too you can see the poet transforming. In a novelistic memoir documentary entitled Bitter Lemons, Lawrence Durrell gave us additional supporting evidence for his thesis. What is singularly interesting, however, is that out of the material of the Alexandria Quartet, out of life in Egypt, and possibly supported by influences in France, which he loved very much and where he really ended his life, Lawrence Durrell developed an ever-increasing interest, and of course this is what endears him to me greatly, in Gnosticism. So Durrell's attitude was expressed by him several times, and in the foreword of this one I think I should be able to read to you, especially if I find it. He wrote the foreword to his friend Jacques Lacarriere's little book on the Gnostics, which, by the way, was a very seminal book, because, let me see what was published by Dutton. Well, anyway, 1977, that's pretty early, when there was very little available of this sort. And all that we need, now let's see, the document, he writes, that's Lawrence Durrell, the documentation we possess on the Gnostics is almost as scanty as that on the Etruscans, and much of it comes from the opposition, so to speak, from the Church Fathers. And you've got to remember that he wrote this in the early 70s, before Naj Hammadi. It's very scanty information. Lacarriere has used his sources, says Durrell, with skill and honesty, and this essay, namely the book, is of a burning tropicality to a world which is also approaching Gnosticism, playing at Gnosticism, the pathetic cockroach world of the anti-hero with his anti-memoirs, not to mention his anti-poetry. So Lawrence Durrell was pretty disgusted with the world at that time. Cockroach world. Well, I'm going to use that. How noble in comparison with the shallow hippie defeatism is the grand poetic challenge of the Gnostics. They refused to countenance a world which was less than perfect, and they affronted the great lie of Lucifer, Mammon, namely the material world, with the hopeless magnificence of the Spartan 300. You know that Spartan 300 when they died. So by this time, Lawrence Durrell was very favorable to the Gnostics. Now, what kind of Gnostic was Lawrence Durrell? This is difficult to answer. He was not the same kind of Gnostic I am, but then there are always as many Gnostics or Gnosticisms as there are Gnostics. Otherwise, we would not be Gnostics. So among his later works, in the Avignon Quincunx, there is one book entitled Monsieur, and is occupied almost entirely with his particular vision of the Gnostic quest. Now again, it is very different from the Alexandria Quartet, and it makes for a different kind of reading. As in other novels of Durrell, we have an English protagonist, a doctor this time, called Bruce, and a French diplomat named Pierce, with his sister Sylvia. The threesome have a conscious and highly unconventional relationship, which may be called incestuous, but mostly in an alchemical sense. The principal location is the medieval city of Avignon, with its memories of a papal court, Knights Templar, and similar esoterica. The threesome becomes involved in a new Gnostic group based in Egypt, and not based in Hollywood, I'm sorry to say, based in Egypt and led by an Egyptian called Akkad. Among others, Akkad leads them into a strange spot in the desert. Oh, that's a terrific scene, where he gives Bruce a vision of Monsieur, the Prince of the World. And I'll just give a little indication of that. The Monsieur is the Gnostic demiurge, and a spiritual being, but of a sinister nature, who basically rules this world, and who appears at this particular meeting. And it's an awesome description. It's like a mixture between a serpent and a crocodile, and it wiggles on the table and comes over to him, wiggles over their food, and he says, "Eat this because this is my holy communion." What an incredible thing! In any event, it's different to come to any definitive conclusions from Monsieur, except that in many ways he continues with the theme of his entire literary message, namely Durrell. The poet is the true Gnostic, the way shower. The world is not as it appears. The less poetic and the more prosaic people are the more illusory and deceptive in their vision of the world. As he implied earlier, the poet and the potential Gnostic must renounce his environment, where he comes from. He must deracinate himself. He must tear out his own roots in the world, otherwise there is no transformation. Well, when divorced from the highfalutin poetic language, I think that's exactly what C.G. Jung would say, and it is what C.G. Jung did in the Red Book and all of that. He pulled himself out of the outer world. The poet and Gnostic must also experience the fullness of life. One One even must know evil. Oh, Jung would agree. Otherwise, one does not know. One should not be stopped by conventional shibboleths and taboos in one's experiencing of life. One need not do evil, but one must know it without denying it. Yes, straight Jung, only put in poetic terms. One must experience everything in some way, otherwise one cannot be transformed. We can outgrow only what we know. What we do not know continues to hold us in a variety of ways. Absolutely. Absolutely. For we have really just the message of the Black Book and the Alexandria Quartet, and to some degree some books of the Avignon Quincunx, particularly Monsieur, and with some other minor works in more recent times. Well, now it's not so recent. And the new keynote appears in Durrell. One must learn how to radically reject the world. There is really only one way to deal with Monsieur, the Lord of the world, the Prince of the world, and that is to get away from him. This is and therefore in Monsieur there appears a suicide metaphor. Well, to me that's a little bit too much. And I don't think Lawrence Durrell really meant it. He certainly lived a fairly long time, and he really liked his drink too, as a good Englishman. So he was in France and drank all the good French wines. So there is really only one way to deal with Monsieur, and that is to get away from him. And it is by losing one's life that one gives eternal life, said St. Francis. Other similar statements. Only the empty cup can be filled. We cannot be full of one reality model and also gain another. And so what he really advocates largely in the Avignon Quincunx is a radical readjustment, a change in ourselves. It is a little like suicide, and he used the suicide metaphor, but he didn't really mean it, except that afterwards we're still alive. Well, that kind of suicide, okay, except differently. And so I think what we have in Lawrence Durrell is a fabulous poetic bringing together of the need for transformation and an envisioning, perhaps correctly, of the poetic soul as being the pioneer in that kind of transformation. And if that is indeed so, that what we need are more poets, but perhaps not the ones who call themselves poets nowadays very much, but maybe the kind of poets like Lawrence Durrell himself. And so here we have really a modern Gnostic writer and poet who certainly in that creative period of the 60s, the 70s, into the 80s, I think, had a considerable influence on the thinking of a good many people, and who possibly with that influence has contributed to the kind of interior transformation without which there is no future, no real future. And one prays to God that he would come back, or somebody would come back, and make as good a case for that kind of transformation as he did, and get society away from the futile and at the same time often very malign preoccupations in which it is involved today, and which, if carried to their extreme, hopefully not, but if carried to their extreme, can only lead to more disaster, more denseness, and less consciousness. People like this are the carriers of the torch of consciousness, and while he is no longer with us this evening, just for myself and maybe for the rest of us, I want to thank the slender Englishman in Alexandria and later on in France, who held up the torch of Gnosis in his own way. Thank you, Lawrence Durrell. Thank you.